Etienne de la Boissy squared. Welcome to the podcast again.
It's good to be with you again and your audience.
This is a little quick turnaround. We did a little, I guess, a meme, or you did a meme, and I just did a little edit for Australia. And you were just telling me that all countries have a very similar setup where we have a two-party system, but it's all a big scam.
Without a doubt, do you wanna take people through the original meme, and I'll break it down for the United States, and then I thought maybe I could break it, like we could both break it down or I'd let you break it down for Australia. I'll break it down for the United States, and then I'll throw it to you to show you the version for Australia. But if you'll let me share my screen, I'll throw it up there, and we'll talk about what show people what we're talking about.
All right.
So here it is. And so for way background, I have a Substack at artofliberty.substack.com. And in my Substack, I did an article, and in fact, I might even go ahead and bring the article up as well. Hold on one second, so we can just like address that too. But the article was entitled "The Fake Left-Right Paradigm: What is the real political spectrum the monopoly media is hiding?" And the thesis is that the fake left-right political spectrum is about control. Now, in the United States, I got it up on the screen here. The government and the monopoly media and most state college professors of politics would tell you that the spectrum is communism on the far left, and then as you move toward the center, you run into socialism, and then kind of liberalism, and then you get moderates are in the middle, and then as you move further right, you get to conservatives, and then you get to libertarians, and then you get to fascists on the far right. But if you really think about it, this doesn't really make any sense, because fascism doesn't have anything to do with libertarianism. The jump from conservatism to libertarianism is essentially a desire for more personal and economic liberty. It has nothing to do with, more totalitarianism control that the leap from libertarianism to fascism represents. And so this doesn't really, make any sense. But that's the only thing that you're going to see on the monopoly media or in a government classroom or whatever. And so what I did, and I pro-modified it. I don't know who did the original. It wasn't attributed. It was a little bit different than this. So I had my assistant recreate it, and then I changed it up a little bit. But if you really think about it on a left-right spectrum, the real political spectrum starts on the left with state control and tyranny, and it rolls through communism, and then fascism, and then socialism, and then liberals. And in the United States, the fascism and liberalism is Democrats. And people, like in the United States, a lot of feedback like I get is like, Democrats aren't fascism. That's Republicans are the fascist ones. That's the politics of government. And to quote Mussolini, fascism is the merger of government and corporate power. But here in the United States, the Democrats are just as in bed with corporate power as the Republicans are. The corporate power is funding them both, and what I would argue is kind of like a fake dichotomy. But fascism does represent a little bit less state control than communism, and a little bit less state control than communism, and socialism is a little bit less. So it does make sense. And so fascists and liberals is kind of represented by the Democratic Party. And then as you roll right, you go past kind of what we'll call the middle, and then you hit conservatives, and then the Tea Party is kind of a libertarian branch of the Republican Party. And so then that makes sense. Rhino in the United States is Republican in name only. And so there's a lot of congressional people that run as Republicans, but they vote as Democrats, and they're known as rhinos. And so that makes sense. They're over here, on Democrats. And then after the Tea Party, you get to libertarianism, and then you get to anarcho-capitalism, and you get to voluntarism. And then I argue that voluntarism is real freedom. And so it's an absence of political, social, or economic control. And so that is the real political spectrum. And so why do they lie? Why do they make that up? Well, because that makes the left right, that makes this spectrum makes both the Democrats and the Republicans look a lot less attractive than they do. In the article, I go on to point out here in the United States, and we'll open it up to Australia in a second, and I'm sure it's probably the same with you, but there isn't really a lot of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats when it comes right down to it. And so here's another meme. I created this meme, and it's meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And what I'm illustrating is in the United States, and I'm going to bet that it's the same in Australia, but in the United States, the two parties are 100% aligned on all of the issues that are important to the real ruling class, the bankers that own the government. I look at the government as a technique for robbing and controlling populations. I look at the bankers as having instituted it so they can do their fractional reserve banking and they can control the economy. But whether the issue is transferring billions to Israel, Democrats and Republicans are in lockstep, hiding the Epstein client list, enabling Israel's genocide in Gaza, the scam of the COVID, forcing unnecessary vaccines, taxing or thefting you, them giving orders and you obeying, NSA, CIA surveillance, fascist crony capitalism, private prisons for victimless crimes, regulatory capture in the agencies, no bid contracts. There were trillions missing from the Pentagon under the Democrats. There's trillions missing from the Pentagon under the Republicans. TSA molestation in security theater, fractional reserve banking, bank and COVID bailouts, AMA monopoly medicine, mandatory government schools. They're both aligned on.
Maybe computer's having a meltdown.
No, my camera is overheating,
Oh.
and so yeah, so like this is my third podcast of the day. It's, so anyway, what I was saying is, then I created this visualization, and for those that are just listening, it's called Shift the Overton Window, and I've got total tyranny on the far left, and then you move to Mao, Stalin, Hitler, and then you move a little bit further and you get Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And then as you go kind of really far, you get a guy named Ron Paul, who's kind of the best known advocate of liberty in the United States, closer to real freedom on the far right. And then you get Etienne de la Boetie squared, myself. And so the weaponized control of perception media in this kind of Overton window where they're both closer to Mao and Hitler and Stalin than they are to real freedom. And that fake dynamic of you've only got these two choices, you've got the left or the right, and the left is Kamala Harris and the right is Donald Trump. That fake dynamic traps everybody's mind in what's in the United States. I'm sure you guys have it too, a Hobson's choice, which is like a fake choice. Old man Hobson ran a livery stable, and you could rent any horse as long as it was the one at the end. And so it's a fake choice between these two dynamics that aren't really a real choice at all, because the whole thing has been a scam. And so then in the rest of the article, I broke down, well, what is the honest map of the political spectrum? And this right here is something that's been known as the Nolan chart. And it's also known as the diamond chart. It's also known as the world quiz. But in the article, I break down how a student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, who went on to found the Libertarian Party, actually created, looked at this fake left-right paradigm and said, well, how would you actually break down the political spectrum in a way that makes sense? And so he came up with the Nolan chart, diamond chart, world's smallest political quiz that measures your aptitude for either personal liberty or totalitarian control on one axis, and then he measured your propensity or desire for personal liberty or totalitarian control on economic issues. And so if you like a lot of personal liberty in personal issues, but not a lot on economic issues, well, then that means that you're kind of like on the left, right? So that tracks, right? And so if you don't favor a lot of economic freedom, but you favor a lot of personal freedom, you show up in the left-hand quadrant of liberals. If you favor a lot of like not a lot of personal issues. So if you think about Republicans here in the United States, they love economic freedom. So low regulations, low taxation, so lots of economic freedom, but they're not, they want to control, you can't smoke plants, you can't gamble, you can't use prostitutes, things like that. So they want to curtail personal freedom. And so that puts you on the right-hand quadrant. But what if you're 100% for economic freedom and 100% for personal freedom? Well, that puts you into the libertarian quadrant. I modified this and I made a chasm right here. And the difference between a voluntarist and a libertarian is voluntarists think that government is illegitimate, undesirable, and unnecessary. And your run-of-the-mill libertarians, minarchists, we call minarchists for minimum, government, they do think government is legitimate, desirable, and necessary. And so that's why I've got like the chasm here. And this actually makes sense. And this actually, tracks the, way better, determinant of what the actual political spectrum is than the fake left-right paradigm that I just showed you. And so this is an example of one that he did in his paper in 1971 when he invented it, and he's rotated it here so that it's just a regular left-right axis. But if you just turned it 45 degrees, then you would get the diamond chart. And so they just made it kind of easier to understand by rotating it. He didn't rotate it in this one, but it's the same dynamic. And then he charted a bunch of politicians from Goldwater to Eugene McCarthy to the Kennedys to President Johnson and Nixon to the John Birch Society to countries like South Africa to Nazi Germany to prove the validity and the accuracy of the model. And so then the final visualization that I did is I did voluntarism as the amount of external government based on coercion and control versus the amount of consciousness, internal governance, and respect of self-ownership and present in society. And so if you're unconscious, it's unconscious versus enlightened. If you're enlightened, you realize that you don't want to impose your ruler on somebody else. If you're enlightened, you don't want to advocate for the violence of government. If you're enlightened, you don't want to vote to rob your neighbor or vote to have your ruler imposed on your neighbor. If you're unconscious, then you don't realize that that's what you're doing if you're advocating government. And so in that case, we've got voluntarism up here on the top. And then as we move kind of to the traditional right and the left, you've got libertarianism, you've got a republic based on classical liberalism on the left, socialism and communism. And then on the right, you've got libertarianism again, you've got a republican based on classic conservatism, then crony capitalism, and then pure fascism. And so that all makes sense and that all tracks. And it's, again, a better way of visualizing the world with an understanding of the realities of voting for violence and advocating violence on others. And then the final one is there's a gentleman by the name of Chris Rufer who broke down the values quadrant on your propensity. Okay, are you for persuasion? Are you for physical coercion? And are your personal values progressive and conservative? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. We've lost my green screen. We've lost my camera. It's physically hot to the touch, by the way. So I think I just I overused it today. This is the first time that I've used it for three podcasts in a row since I moved to a 35 millimeter. And so now we're using my laptop. But what I was saying is that the final kind of visualization is if you're a progressive and you believe in persuasion. Chris Rufer calls that the philosophy of human respect. You can swap out the term voluntarism. If you're progressive and you believe in physical and you're okay with physical coercion, you're a Democrat. If your personal values are conservative and you believe in persuasion, you're for the philosophy of human respect. If you're a conservative and you're okay with physical coercion, then you're a Republican. And so again, a better way. And then he beautifully breaks down the philosophy of human respect in a link that I shared in the article. And actually, I forgot I've got one more. And I was doing a podcast with James Corbett at the Corbett Report, and we were talking about his book Reportage. And he's like, I want to collaborate with you. I want to have, because I in my book I break down, the political spectrum as kind of the uppists versus the downists. And the idea is that, that really most people want more peace and privacy and freedom and decentralization. He calls those people downists. They just want to be left alone by the government. And then there's a small minority of people that want more taxes, inflation, regulation, surveillance, war, and government because they're benefiting from it. And this is generally the banks that are stealing the value out of the currency through fractional reserve banking and their puppets in government and the roundtable groups and the Bilderberg and the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum and the Trilateral Commission and most politicians. And even though they're in the minority, they're driving everything up, even though the overwhelming majority wants more of that. And so I did that. So I did that visualization for James. But these are much better ways of really understanding that the battle is not left versus right. It's freedom versus control.
Mm.
And this is what what the political what the real political spectrum looks like. And now I think the audience has a little bit of a better idea of why the government would be kind of lying and manipulating and changing like the political spectrum to things that people don't really believe in, because they're trying to hide what the real spectrum is. And then I thought I'd throw it open to you to see if you had any comments on what I said. And then I thought you could break it down for the Australian version and tell people a little bit, like, if you agree. Am I right on? Is it the exact same thing? I know I've been dominating the conversation, so I wanted to give you a chance to talk as well.
I think what it does highlight, and I think it would highlight for many people if they think about it, that it is exactly the same in our country as it is in the UK, as it is in New Zealand. We're offered this election, and they basically, no matter who you vote for, and I think this is something that's happening more probably since the pandemic, where people are looking for alternatives from the major parties. I think people are starting to turn off the major parties. In Australia, we had an election in the last, I think it was in the last 12 months, who knows. But the party that won, I believe, only had 30%, 32% of the vote, but they still win on a more than 50% majority somehow, because a lot of people had turned away from those two parties. I think the party that won had 32%, and the party that is the other party that seems to win had something like 20%. So half of the country didn't like either of those two parties. But then we have all these independents and the Greens and but nothing changes. It's still one of those two parties ruling, and and as you said there, nothing. that so they argue on little topics. So Labor and the Greens might agree that, transgender things are an issue. They'll say that they support, say, refugees. They'll say that, war is bad, but they're still doing the same thing. They'll still bail out the banks. They'll still protect corporations. They're still selling Australia's or giving away Australia's resources to foreign corporations for nothing. These corporations pay no tax. And then they look at ways to tax the people harder. So, but then the Liberal Nationals will get in and they'll be against immigration. They'll say they're against something like transgender issues or against climate change. But as a whole, the policies stay the same. The major issues never change. And I think that's something that most people can see. But I think you would have the same thing in the States where some people, we call them rusted on. So they're, no matter what happens, they support their team. And
Yep.
it doesn't matter how bad they are, they still support their team. Those people are completely blind. And no matter what you say, they'll never change their opinion. But I think there is a growing volume of the population who have had enough of the two major parties. And I think now the next step is making them see that no matter what happens, that across the board, this system is not working.
Now you actually did two different visualizations, and I'll throw the other one up too because I wanted you to just talk to that and address it because it looks like that they're also running kind of the same. You've got the same Overton window of no matter the two, it may be the left or right, but it's not really the opposite ends of the spectrum. It is the it's still on the far left. It's much closer to total tyranny and government control than it is. And so I don't know who these folks are, but since I'm going to share this with my audience too, who are Anthony Albanese and Susan Ley and Gerald Rennick?
Yeah, so Anthony Albanese is the Prime Minister at the moment. He's the Labor Party, which would be equivalent to the Democrats.
Hmm.
And he won as I said on I think it's 30%. It's no more than that. Uh, Susan Ley is the leader of the Liberal National Party, which the Liberal National. It's funny that liberals in America are called Democrats, but the Liberal National Party would be equivalent to the Republicans in America. So it's the same. Susan Ley is kind of on the right side. Albanese is on the left side. But as I said, that they very cleverly have us arguing over things like refugees and immigration and transgender issues. And Labor came from, I guess, the union movement where they say they are protecting workers. But then, even when they're in power, workers' rights are eroded just as they would be under the Liberal National Party. So, and that's why it's really obvious that the major things like bailing out the banks and say during the pandemic, the Liberal Party were in power nationally and ran the whole, take the injection and lockdowns. And Labor were in power in most of the states at the time, maybe all of them. And they were doing exactly the same thing. They were bashing their citizens for not wearing masks and protesting on the streets and making people stand 1.5 meters apart, 6 foot apart. And so their policies are exactly the same on the big stuff,
Yep.
but they have us arguing on the little things.
So it's the exact same here, Paul. And we call them, I call them football issues, or it's known popularly as football issues. And a football issue is an issue that you can kick back and forth all day long, and it really doesn't matter to the ruling establishment. What mattered to the ruling establishment was everybody was going to take that shot.
Mm.
or everybody's going to go along with fractional reserve banking, or everybody's going to go along with wars that we don't need to fight using overpriced weapon systems, based on lies and manufactured intelligence. Or here in the United States, we give trillions of dollars to banks and companies and bailouts and stimulus. And like the both of the parties, they're 100% in lockstep on these important issues. They're just pretending to argue about the issues that don't really matter. And the one other thing that I wanted to say, kind of based on, what you were talking about is, you talked about how 30% of the population, they only got 30% of the vote, but yet they still walk away with the government. Here in the United States, over somewhere around 50% of the population, and it varies from election to election and depends on who's running, but somewhere around 50% of the population doesn't win. And so the winner is somebody that ends up with, the majority of around 50% of the vote. So it may be 24 to 30%. And so they end up like the majority of the population has decided not to participate, doesn't believe in government, whatever reason they didn't vote. But they still claim a mandate, even though they've got less than 30% of people voted for the Donald Trump. Less than 30% of the country voted for Donald Trump, and yet he pretends he has a mandate when less than 30% of the population voted for him. In some American cities, when I lived in Sedona, it was only 20% of the population that voted in Sedona, as an example. And yet the government is just going to go ahead and roll over you, even if you didn't vote, even if you don't support it. They're going to pretend like they have some kind of mandate, and that's just another kind of scam of the system. But I think the one thing that is the takeaway from our conversation is that it appears to be that all of these governments are running the same bag of tricks, and they're all pretending the political spectrum is something that it's not, and they're all pretending to argue about things that don't really matter, while they're both 100% in lockstep on the things that do matter to the people that are running the system and that are extracting wealth out of the system.
Mm. Yeah, and I believe in our last federal election, I think that because voting is compulsory in Australia, so you have to vote or they send you a fine. I think it's a nominal fine, like it might be $100 or something. But
Really?
yeah, so they get everyone to vote. But interestingly, I think in the last election, the people that didn't vote for anyone would have come third. So, so people still went, marked their name off, and then didn't vote for anyone or put a comment, puppets or whatever they put in there. And I think they got 8 or 11%, something like that. But I remember looking at the time thinking they would have come third. So people have turned off.
So, one of the things I talked about in one of the previous podcasts is, in the quote unquote founding of the United States, we didn't have a strong centralized government. We had something called the Articles of Confederation, and the government had no, ability to tax the population. In the United States during our Revolutionary War, the government had made a bunch of government promises where they'd issued a bunch of bonds to Civil War soldiers or revolutionary soldiers and people that they bought supplies from, and gunpowder and saltpeter and muskets and uniforms and everything that you can imagine. So they'd issued all of these bonds with no ability to repay because the government didn't have any tax. And so there were just thousands and thousands, millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of these bonds that had become completely worthless after, like decades of not, after almost a decade or like somewhere, maybe even over a decade of not being paid. And so there was a convention, the famous, if you know anything about, U.S. history, the famous Philadelphia Convention of 1787, where they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, but instead the convention gets hijacked, and the delegates that are running it, who were not the famous revolutionaries of the of the, the American Revolution, they were essentially a collection of politicians and lawyers, and over half of them wanted a monarchy of some sorts. They weren't enlightened in any way, shape, or form, but they hijack it. They produce an unauthorized replacement, and after about almost half the delegates either didn't show up because they suspected, Patrick Henry said he smelt a rat, and that's the reason he didn't attend. And like, so some people knew that there was a scam afoot. Some people left early, said this is BS. Some people wouldn't sign, and over almost half of them, didn't participate or wouldn't sign or left early. So they produce an unauthorized, replacement that does give the government the ability to tax. I don't believe you can do that legitimately. I don't think like you can write down on a fancy piece of paper that you have the ability to steal people's money and make up rules for people. But then they were controlling the same system that we're under, where it's the government and the media working together. So the newspapers at the time proclaim it valid, and then in that case, during the revolution, there were probably, or during this time period of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, there were there were about 3 million people living on the American continent, within the colonies, and less than 1% of them actually voted, and I believe tricked into. So we're going to have an election that we control, okay, where we're going to put our people, for the first election, like a complete scam. Less than 1% of the population, is tricked into voting. And then based on less than 1%, now the newspapers say, we have a new government, and all 3 million people are now obliged to participate in this new government with less than 1% of people voting. And then once they have a new government, they raise an army, they begin taxing the population, they have mandatory government schools, they begin raising people up in the belief system and everything like that. But the American founding of the country was less than 1% of the population being tricked into participating in an illegitimate, immoral, illogical system. And then the newspapers of the time, which were owned by the financial interests, they come along and proclaim the whole thing valid. And then, to circle back to the bonds that I was talking about, so they go and they scoop up all the bonds. And once it became clear that they'd already bought up a lot of them, kind of, prior to the convention, but once it becomes clear that they're about to get a new government, now they begin sending riders up and down the eastern coast and the eastern seaboard of the United States, schooners, ships, sailing ships up and down the coast, and they're trying to buy up all the bonds, as many bonds as they can, and they buy up all of these bonds. And then Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury, of the U.S. Treasury, he then pays these speculators 100% on the dollar for these bonds that had been outstanding for over a decade with no ability to pay him back. And he was one of the participants that installed this government that gave him the ability to steal money so that he could pay off the bonds. And then he went on to pay the debts of the states that had racked up. So then some states, especially Massachusetts, show up with a bunch of receipts and say, "Hey, the government owes us all of this money," and then he pays them. And another one of the founding fathers, a guy named Thomas Jefferson, openly questioned the validity and the amounts of these debts. And he's like, this smells like we're getting hosed. And so this is the kind of chicanery that you get with government. It's been with the United States since the beginning. I'm sure there's probably an equivalent of Australia, but this is the dirty, tricks that they use to to be able to steal money, from people, and then hand it to speculators and financial interests and cronies.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the video that you shared. I can't remember if it was on your email or on your Substack with the Jimmy Dore video on Argentina. But I
Yeah.
think what it what that shows, and I think what once you see this, and the pandemic was a good example of how they are constantly creating fake issues, and these are on all scales. So they create a fake issue. They use tax money to prop up their buddies in the corporate world,
Mhm.
and then that's the solution. So none of these issues. So like during COVID, they come up with this injection in a short space of time. They use all the taxpayer money to buy. I think in Australia, we our population is 25, 26 million. I think they bought 180 million doses. And it doesn't matter if they go off or people want them in the first place.
Yeah.
They're not answerable to anybody. They buy 180 million doses with our money. Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca get rich, and then they can just throw them all in the bin. It doesn't matter because they were doing it to help us. And this is the
Yeah.
same fake story over and over and over again. And as I said, Australia at the moment is close to $1 trillion in debt. I think our economy is only $1 trillion.
Mhm.
They're instead of so all these foreign multinationals are mining Australia's coal and iron ore and uranium and whatever else. It's all being shipped to China, but Australia's net zero, so they're going to burn it in another country and somehow that's net zero. But they're giving it to these foreign corporations, then saying, how are we going to recover the debt? Well, instead of being creative and creating new jobs and making things in Australia, what they're going to do is look at things like taxing people's spare bedroom because there's a housing shortage, or collecting more revenue on the roads with cameras everywhere and fining people for nothing. So it's
Yep.
just the same thing over and over again. How do we collect more money from the people and give it to our buddies in the corporate world?
Yeah, so we have the exact same thing. There's a group within the kind of the Pentagon called BARDA, BARDA. I forget what it stands for, but essentially they stockpile vaccines for essentially everything that you can imagine. And then as soon as they expire, they buy millions and millions and hundreds of millions of doses, and then they, restock them until they expire, and then they buy them again, and they just keep they it's been going on for, quite some time. Whether, it's like one of the scams that they do. The scam that you mentioned on the Jimmy Dore video is, here in the United States, what's happened is there's a scandal going on where the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Scott Bessent, who used to work for a He was, one of George Soros's right hand men. He comes from the hedge fund industry. He just engineered, won through the IMF, a $20 billion bailout of Argentinian bonds and debt. And then after that wasn't enough, he engineered another $20 billion from the US Treasury, again for Argentina. And then it comes out that one of his personal friends and former colleagues, who's another George Soros associated hedge fund manager, had made billions and billions of dollars worth of bets. And very similar to the scandal that I described at the founding of the country, had gone out and had bought up Argentinian debt, which was free falling, um, and then skyrocketed once his buddy Scott, personal friend and buddy Scott Bessent, engineered these two $20 billion, 40 billion total Argentinian bailout. Well, of course, that pops the bonds, and so they're going to privatize the profits while they're socializing the cost of the bailout against, the entire population of the United States and wherever the IMF gets their money. And so they're socializing the cost while they're privatizing the profits for a small, group of insiders. But this is why it's, I say it's intergenerational organized crime. And then they're controlling the media so that the media is not going to tell you about it. except for these pirate broadcasts like Jimmy Dore or my Substack or your podcast. We're talking about it right now. But most of the media is not going to connect the dots about what happened, even though they know what happened. They're not going to connect the dots for the viewer because that's how you lose your job. Because the job of the media is not, there's a famous ABC executive said news is something that somebody wants to suppress. Everything else we do is advertising. And that's really what the media is. It's advertising for, this intergenerational organized crime system using government to rob the population in a variety of scandals, of which we've just touched on three or four, but these three or four that we've touched on are billions, and in the case of the COVID, $1 trillion, globally worth of either economic warfare on the population or crony capitalism, or the scam of buying vaccines that don't really do what they say they're going to do, that actually hurt the population instead. And again, socializing the cost of that while privatizing the profits into the hands of the people that force the politicians to do it in the first place.
Mm. I think also what that video highlights is that so Malay was promoted, I guess, during after COVID, that he was, the alternative to government. He was going to reduce government. He was going to do all these things. But then really what he's done, it's more like technocracy. He's
Mhm.
employed instead of having no government and allowing people to choose the market themselves on local issues, he's reducing government and then giving tax money to the corporations to run. So it's like technocracy where the experts run the country rather than the politicians. But really, it's the same thing. And what it highlights is that people think, well, I'll vote for this person because they're more like me, but
Mhm.
they're really just the same. So they're really still going to steal your money and give it to the corporations. It just depends on what mechanism they're going to use, whether they're going to say, well, government's bad. And I feel there's a little bit of a feeling in the air where people are realizing government's bad. But that doesn't mean what we're saying is, yeah, government's bad, but it doesn't mean we want to move to a situation where we can steal the population's money and give it to the corporations directly, or steal people's money and give it to the corporations through government.
Yeah, absolutely. So, he presents himself as an anarcho-capitalist, but if he was a real anarcho-capitalist, he would say that government is illegitimate on its face. He's keeping that he's not, he's tweaking the economy. He is doing things that are favorable to business. He has done things like reduce rent control and things that have seen the housing market pop. But what he's doing is he's doing it in a way that allows the government to continue taking tax money and moving it into these private interests, including now, I'm assuming that some of this $40 trillion has been tacked onto the back of the Argentinian taxpayer, and some of this debt is going to be expected to be paid by the population. And so these aren't really anarcho-capitalist policies, no matter what he says. It is more attuned to what we would call crony capitalism. It's not free market. It's not. There are free market reforms, but it's not free market.
Mm. And I think that's a comment that you'll see a lot where people say, "Oh, look what capitalism has done to the US and their debt, or Australia and the debt." But it isn't capitalism. It is crony capitalism. It's a corporatocracy where the corporations and, as you say, where the banks are running everything, or the BlackRocks and the Vanguards are running everything, and the governments are just sort of the middle management who are, making it look like it's our decision what's happening.
Yeah, so I agree with that completely. The tweak that I would give it is I think it's the banks on top. And I think that the banks have engineered their financial interests around central banking, Rothschild central banking, have installed government in the United States for the original financial scam that I discussed, but also to be able to legalize fractional reserve banking, which is the ability to create money out of thin air. And the example that I give is, when you go to, get a mortgage or a car loan, or if you have a credit card, they're not loaning you bank money. They're not loaning you depositor money. The bank just creates that digital cash in your account, even though that process is inflationary, even though that process is stealing the value out of everybody else's money. And so if I had, if there were only $2 in the world and I had one, and you, dear viewer, dear listener, had the other dollar, and so you have 50% of the world's wealth and I have 50% of the world's wealth, and a bank or a government comes along and creates two additional dollars through fractional reserve banking or through quantitative easing or through digital dollar creation or through a printing press. Okay, they've now stolen 50% of the world's wealth, and you and I, dear listener, dear viewer, have been reduced to 25% of the world's wealth. Now magnify that by creating trillions of dollars, and you understand why the price of everything is going up. And so they're stealing the value out of everybody's money because that process is inflationary. Because whether it's an Australian dollar or whether it's a US dollar, it's a little bit like I don't know if you have baseball cards in Australia, but in the United States, if there's only one Mickey Mantle, rookie card from 1927, then it's worth a whole bunch of money. If there's two of them, it's not worth the same amount. If somebody finds a case of them in a warehouse, then the value of that Mickey Mantle baseball card collapses. And so a dollars are a little bit like that as well. So as the banks create more and more and more, there is this amazing amount of dollars that begin bidding up prices and competing for a scarce amount of goods and services. And then the corporations and the government that created the money in the first place, it's called the Cantillon effect. They get an outsized value out of the fresh dollars that come on the market, and then by the time those circulate to the rest of the society, it's gonna buy a lot less down the line. And so it's inherently it is inherently dishonest monetary system that creates crazy profits, quote unquote profits. I would argue that it's just a sophisticated form of theft. But what they're doing, what I think the banks are doing, is they're creating these dollars out of thin air. They're buying up real plant, property, equipment, factories, real estate, companies. So they're providing certain companies in the economy with unlimited fractional reserve dollars. Those companies are trading as a cartel. They're buying up and consolidating their competitors with these unlimited fractional that you would not see in a free market, that you would not see in real capitalism. You only see it in this crony capitalist system. Those companies they buy up are being managed by BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and Barclays and other, I forget the one in Canada that Mark Carney came from. Forget the Canada BlackRock, the name of the Canadian BlackRock. But those companies are holding the ownership of these companies stolen with fractional reserve dollars. And then the executives, the C-level executives, in the case of the media companies, the publishers, the editors, the reporters, they're being organized into these front groups like the World Economic Forum, like the Council on Foreign Relations, like the Bilderberg Group. And then they're using the wealth of the companies that have been bought up and stolen through fractional reserve banking to coordinate their activities, to have this media monopolization, to be able to, control the content of, across dozens and dozens and dozens of ostensibly independent media companies. And we have some visualizations in both my book, Government, the Biggest Scam in History, and To See the Cages, to Leave It, where you can actually see the reporters and the editors and the publishers from dozens and dozens of ostensibly independent media companies. They're all meeting. They're on a regular basis in secure facilities around the world at these Bilderberg meetings, these Council on Foreign Relations meetings, these World Economic Forum meetings. So they're getting together where they're given their marching orders. And so then once you realize that, oh wait, there's dozens and dozens of independent media companies, but all the editors, reporters, and publishers are all in these three organizations. That Jeffrey Epstein was a member of all three of those organizations, by the way. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, I guess they could trick the population with the COVID. I guess all the reporters could be in on it. They're all in these three organizations that have ties to the banking system and to the government, and they're all getting together and they're meeting in secure facilities around the world on a regular basis. So they could be given marching orders. And so all of a sudden you're like that when you see how they're connected. That's one of the things that we do at the Art of Liberty Foundation is we use visualization to make something that was invisible now visible. And so now that you can see these connections using visualization, you're like, oh, maybe they could have pulled off the COVID like that. And then it makes something again that was invisible now visible to you, and you have a greater insight as to how the system works.
Yeah, and Canada is a great example how a banker, Mark Carney, is now their prime minister. Like he's just been installed to do the next part of the job. And I think, that's again going back to the two-party thing. People think, oh, well, it's just if I vote for my person, they're going to do what I want. But really, all they're doing is progressing the agenda, which is put forward by these bankers. And if anyone thinks that our governments are actually in charge, you can look at something like a digital ID or COVID,
Mhm.
where every country is doing the same thing at the same time, but for different reasons. In America, the digital ID, or the UK digital ID, is to stop illegal immigrants. In Australia, it's to save the kids from it's online safety. So they're all doing it. It's all voluntary, but then they do things like where you can't access your bank or a job or without it. So it's all
Mhm.
voluntary, but it's compulsory under the table. And and as you said, so the governments are just there. This is something that I wonder, this false binary of the two-party lie. Part of it is to enable the game, isn't it? But
Mhm.
also, is it to keep us distracted so that we are arguing over these football issues?
Without a doubt, 100%. I agree with that completely. Um, the They would rather us fight against each other than fight against them. And so all you've got to do is get the pitchfork people and the torch people fighting with each other, and they're not trying to burn down the castle.
Mhm.
And so that divide and conquer, goes back to, like is probably one of the oldest tactics, in warfare. And it still works to this day. Probably one of the funniest things that I've ever done as a parent is I have two sons, and we used to play Risk. And for when we first started playing Risk, I would just completely crush both of my sons like every single time. And then finally, in the way that I do is I just divide and conquer them. And I would just sit there and I would just tell, I'd tell, one of them like, "Are you gonna let your brother do that to you?" And then I'd tell the other one, "Oh my God, I can't believe he did that to you. Like, you're gonna take that?" And I would just get them, I'd get them fighting with each other so that they would leave me alone, and then I would sweep them, towards the end of the game. And then finally they got old enough, or I got bored enough that I finally go, "Hey, do you want me to tell you why dad always wins?" and they're looking at me and they're like, and I go, do you know how I won? And they're like, well, you took over Australia and you did this or you did that or whatever it is. And I go, no. I go, there's a military tactic called divide and conquer, and what I do is I play you and you off against each other. I get y'all mad at each other by making these little comments, and then y'all only fight each other, and then I sit around till the end until I can scoop in and just win everything. And they both look shell shocked, and they both look at each other, and then they both look at me, and they both look at each other, they both look at me, and from that day forward I never won another game because now they're 100% united, kids against dad, instead of being divided and conquered. And maybe there's a lesson in that for our planet and for our society.
Absolutely. I see constantly on social media people, they used to hate Biden. A certain group of people hated Biden. But now people get so upset about Trump. And some of the things that he says, I wonder if the only reason he's saying things that are so outlandish and ridiculous is to keep the people fighting about these things that don't really mean anything. He's just saying it because it gets people so upset and angry, and then they can hate on each other on social media, but he's still progressing the agenda.
Well, also, I think, one of the things is he's doing, and I can make one more point, and then I got to hop because I have a hard stop here in about 3 minutes. Is he's getting so a lot of people in the United States and globally, whatever, are completely turning off the politicians. And so, one of my running jokes is, with this administration is like, this season, the cast of characters, they're so zany. You just never know what's going to happen next. And so they're keeping people tuned in and paying attention with Trump, who is a reality television star. Like a lot of people don't realize that he is a manufactured reality television star. His theatrical agent in Hollywood is actually a guy named Ari Emanuel, and Ari Emanuel is the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff during the Obama administration. And he's the guy that famously said, you never want to let a crisis go to waste. A crisis is the opportunity to do something that you wouldn't have been able to do in any other circumstance. The other brother is Ezekiel Emanuel, who's one of the best known eugenicists in the world and was part of Biden's, eugenics task force. But that's Trump's theatrical agent. And I think that the funny the joke of Trump's show The Apprentice is that Trump was the real apprentice.
Mm.
That's the joke. The joke is can we give this guy the media training and the artificial gravitas, because Trump had gone bankrupt 4 times. And the last bankruptcy he did, I think in 1993, his workout was done by Rothschild Incorporated. And a workout is when your debt gets restructured and they come to the table with fresh financing and everything. But I think that the Rothschilds have had Trump by the balls ever since that, his last bankruptcy. And then after he won the first term of the U.S. presidency, the banker from Rothschild Incorporated that Wilbur is a guy named Wilbur Ross, and Wilbur Ross came in as the Secretary of Commerce and was the Secretary of Commerce in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, I think they are just laughing at us, aren't they, really, at this point?
Well, yes and no, and again, so like the my final thing to say, we'll leave it on a note is, you can only fool people until they understand the game, and I think more and more people are figuring out the game, and then once you realize, in my new book, To See the Cage is to Leave It, again, I'm showing people how the magician does the trick. And what we've discovered at the Art of Liberty Foundation is once people realize, oh, government's a scam, you can't have a legitimate government, the government is running these unethically manipulative techniques, they're tricking the population. Once people realize that, they're out. They're not like you don't go back to being fooled. And so we call that the one-way revolution at the Art of Liberty Foundation. And I think that that's a good thing. And so I'm excited about it. And we're with that, I'm out of time.
Can you just mention where people can buy your books?
Yeah, government, the biggest scam in history is at government-scam.com. To see the cage is to leave it. 25 techniques the few use to control the many is seethecage.com. Art of Liberty Foundation is artofliberty.org. And then a lot of my writings, including the article that you mentioned on Scott Bessent and the article that we were sharing, the slides is available for free. artofliberty.substack.com.
Awesome. Etienne de la Boissy squared. Thanks for joining me and thanks for fixing up the microphone.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you for doing what you do. We are all in this thing together, and so let a thousand flowers bloom.
Yes, let's do this again. I've still got more questions.
Absolutely.
All right,
Talk
mate.
soon.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.